Hello everybody, and welcome to this video lesson on poetry and poetic tools that the poets we're going to be studying this semester are using. So if you will go into the poetry folder in D2L and open up the summer poetry slideshow, we are going to cover about the first 14 slides. So we're going to cover about half that slideshow in this one video lecture. However, I will try to keep it as brief as possible so that I don't bore you to death, and so that you will be able to maintain some remembrance of what I've said. So if you need to, I will go ahead and let you pause for just a second and then go get that slideshow, and I'll be here when you get back. Alright, it looks like if you're watching me now, you have the slideshow ready. I will also be referring to some of the poems in this book that we actually are going to be reading in order to talk about some of these poetic tools. But let's start with the poetry slideshow. I'm going to go ahead and pull it up myself here so I can see what I'm talking about. And we're going to start with what poetry is. Over the last several thousand years, it has actually evolved. Poetry used to be the only way that stories were told, and oftentimes poetry was sung, which may sound familiar now if you're into R&B music, rap music, or any other kind of music. Essentially, music today that you listen to on the radio is poetry set to some kind of music. And so epic poetry and the heroic poem was that kind of poetry. Only they told stories, and these songs would take a long time. So if you've ever read anything by Homer, let's say, particularly the Iliad or the Odyssey, you'll notice that those are some long, long poems. Well, imagine having to sing those by memory. So that's why Homer eventually wrote them down. The dramatic poem, that is what Shakespeare wrote in. It was a blank verse, iambic pentameter with no rhyme. And if you read Shakespeare, you'll notice that it is set up to sound like poetry because that's the way he wrote it. We're not going to spend any time on those two because we don't really read any of those two throughout the course of the summer. However, lyric poetry is something that we're going to discuss in a little bit. Well, let's go to the next slide before we do that. Poetry is a difficult term to pin down. However, most poetry does generally have the following characteristics. One is it has significance. All 5 of the poems that you are going to read for this particular semester are going to have significance of some sort. Some of it could be personal significance, like Sylvia Plath's Daddy, or it could be a social significance, like those of the poems that are written by Langston Hughes. So, significance is something that is usually a part of all poetry. And for a good example of significance, think about your favorite songs today. You may be sitting here right now going, "Oh, Mr. Smith, why are you making us read poetry? I hate poetry." But if you like today's music, you like poetry, because all of today's music is a type of lyric poem. It has some sort of a rhythm. Sometimes we call these meters. Usually iamb, which is an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable, is the most common of the meters. And so it has some sort of rhythm. So if I were to go and pull up, say, for example, William Shakespeare's "My mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun," and you're not watching me, I'm putting on my reading glasses now. Just reading that very first line. "My mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun." Okay. "My mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun. Coral is far more red than her lips red." So if you follow it that way with the unstressed stresses, you see that there's a sort of rhythm that goes on in these poems. May have rhyme, but not necessarily. Now, Shakespeare's sonnets are going to have rhyme, and you'll see why when you actually watch the video lecture and get down to the Shakespeare portion of the slideshow. Sonnets have a specific rhyme scheme. But not all poetry has rhyme. You're going to see when we get to Sylvia Plath and to Langston Hughes that neither one of them put a whole lot of rhyme in their poems, but yet they still write poems. And then the bottom sentence of this slide is very important. Why we study poetry? Well, it's a study of language. It's a study of whatever language that poem is written in. So for us, obviously, it'll be English. But if you take a foreign language class, beyond the beginner classes, but as you go into more advanced foreign language classes, be it Spanish, French, Latin, Japanese, whatever, you will likely see a lot of poetry in those advanced classes, because to study the poetry is to study the language in which the poem is written in. So that's another reason why the study of poetry is very important. Alright, so then we go to the next slide. It's got lyric poem. Again, the most common type of poetry today, and you can see that last bullet point says it's often set to music. Name your favorite artist. There's a good chance that that artist wrote a song in poetic form and then set some kind of music to it. Lyric poems are very short. When we get to Langston Hughes, you're going to see that Harlem is only about 11 lines long. Very, very short. And even Sylvia Plath's Daddy, which takes, I think it's 4 or 5 pages, that is still very short compared to an epic poem or to a dramatic poem. There's often a unified impression, often a single speaker. Sometimes a single speaker can be very inextricably linked with the author. And a good example of that is Sylvia Plath's Daddy. Sometimes a single speaker could be an entire race. When we get to Negro Speaks of Rivers by Langston Hughes, that is the entire, and I'm going to say the entire African race from Africa all the way to African Americans that are speaking in that one. So there won't be a single speaker in Negro Speaks of Rivers, because if there was, that would be one old person. We're talking thousands of years old. Okay. Often expresses a state of mind or a process of perception, thought, and or feeling. I think all of our poems are going to cover some of that. The I in the lyric is often understood to be a fictional speaker, although the poem does have autobiographical elements to it. So when William Shakespeare writes Sonnet 130, one thing I want you to be careful about is not to judge that poem as if William Shakespeare is the speaker. Actually, William Shakespeare has created a fictional narrator that's going to actually do the speaking in that poem. And we will talk about that poem in great detail in the William Shakespeare lecture. And then, of course, again, the lyric poem is often set to music. All right. So that brings us to this question. How do we read poetry in such a way that we can understand it? How do we read poetry in such a way that we can appreciate it? First of all, you need to read a poem more than once. I don't think any of the poems that I selected can be really understood in their entirety just by reading them one time alone. For William Shakespeare, it's only 14 lines because it's a sonnet. For Robert Frost, The Road Not Taken is 20 lines. Harlem is only 11 lines long. And I think that Negro Speaks of Rivers may even be shorter than that. So you can read every poem that we do in this class more than one time. In fact, you're going to probably have to fully understand the poem. Pay attention to the title. Now, for the title of Harlem, Harlem will never appear in the poem, so that's kind of sketchy. But for Daddy, clearly this narrator has issues with her father. In fact, we're going to talk about the Electra complex whenever we get to that poem. Sometimes the title can help you. Identify the speaker and the point of view. In Daddy, most people agree that the speaker is probably Sylvia Plath herself, and she's truly writing to her father. In Negro Speaks of Rivers, the speaker is an entire race, not just one individual. And point of view, is it first person like in Daddy or in Negro Speaks of Rivers, or is it, say, third person, such as, well, actually, I think all of our poems in our readings are all going to be first person. So that'll make that part easy for you. Know the meanings of all the words. Use a dictionary. Before you open up this book and read Because I Could Not Stop for Death by Emily Dickinson, have a dictionary handy. It will come in handy. You're going to need to know what some of these words mean when you read Dickinson. And that's going to be true for just about all of the poets. Maybe not Robert Frost, because he used very simple rustic settings. But for the rest of the poems, well, maybe not for Langston Hughes either. But for the other three, you're definitely going to need to have a dictionary handy to help you identify what the meanings of the words are in order to understand what the poem's about. All right, know the basic form and development. I'm not going to spend much time on that, but it helps to know that My Mistress's Eyes Are Nothing Like the Sun is a sonnet. It helps to know that Langston Hughes and Sylvia Plath are blank verse. It helps to know those things. All right, try to find a unifying theme or a subject to the poem. In other words, what is this poem about? If you can find one theme that every line in the poem is about, then you can understand the poem better. And sometimes it helps to read the poem out loud. If we were actually in a class we would do this. I may still read some lines to you out loud in these upcoming lectures, but if you read the poem out loud, sometimes that can help you understand what the poem means. So that's how to read poetry and get the most out of it, especially since you're going to be writing a paper on a poem. Alright, so that's that portion of the lecture. The next thing I want to discuss is poetic tools. By poetic tools, I mean, what can a poet do? What is available to a poet in order to create the poem that this poet wants to create? So we're going to start on this next slide, which is about the 7th one into the slideshow. First of all, words. You may use bricks to build a house. You may use, I don't know, Legos to build a toy or whatever. Poems are built with words. The words are the bricks. They're the Legos. They're whatever it is that actually creates the poem. Diction can mean good word choice or it can mean enunciation. And both will play a role in poetry. So, again, you're going to need a dictionary when you read Emily Dickinson, but she chose her words specifically for effect. There's an angry tone to Daddy. Sylvia Plath chose the words that she chose for that reason. Meanwhile, Robert Frost chose simple words so that people everywhere could understand his poems. And that's one of the things that people love about Frost so much, is that his poems are kind of easy to understand. Although, we're going to learn when we get to Robert Frost that even though his poems look simple on the surface, there's much deeper meaning underneath. And I'm looking forward to telling you about Robert Frost. Alright. So, there are two different kinds of words. Specific and concrete usually tends to deal with sensory language. That William Carlos Williams poem that I've got on this slide is the entire poem. He was what was known as an imagist, where he chose words that created pictures in people's minds. These are specific, and these are concrete, and these use sensory language. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rain. So imagine a bright red wheelbarrow right after a rainstorm, so there's little droplets of water on it, glazed with rain water, excuse me, beside the white chickens. And close your eyes and picture this now. A red wheelbarrow glazed with droplets of rainwater, and next to that are some bright white feathered chickens strutting around and eating their corn, or cackling along or whatever. This is the kind of words that are specific, they are concrete, they deal with the five senses, and they help the reader to gain a picture in his mind about what's going on. General and abstract usually tends to deal with emotions, thoughts, and questions. So one of the most famous poems in history is Elizabeth Barrett Browning's sonnet, "How do I love thee? Let me count the ways." Love is an abstract concept. We may feel love very strongly, but you can't actually hold love in your hand. You can't actually look in a room and say, "Oh, look at all the love in the room." Now you may see couples kissing, facing, and you may see couples hugging each other, and you may see couples looking at each other in the eyes with this look like, as long as I've got you, I don't need anybody else. That's fine, but those are not. But love itself is not not a concrete thing that you can hold in your hand. You learn about the love by watching the reactions of the other people. All right, and then syntax is word order and sentence structure. In English, we usually have a subject, verb, object, word order. The wife kissed her husband. So the wife is a subject because the wife is the person that's actually taking the action. It's the wife that is doing the kissing. Kissed is a verb, and in this case, a past tense verb. It is the action that the wife has taken by puckering up her lips and placing them against her husband's cheek or against his lips or against his forehead or wherever she's kissing him. And then the husband is the object. He is the receiver of the action. He is the receiver of the kiss. And he's going to turn about 3 shades of red from both embarrassment and happiness, and he'll be on cloud 9. So, usually you have that subject, verb, object, word order, and that's our syntax. In poetry, it is not unusual for a poet to mess with the syntax in order to create a desired effect. And one of the biggest syntax distorters, I guess, for lack of a better term, was a British poet by the name of Gerard Manley Hopkins. He was actually a priest in the Church of England. And so he says, "Why do men now not reck his rod?" Now, what the heck does that mean? Well, let's put it in today's language. So if you look at the next bullet point after that, why do men not recognize God's authority anymore? So he's basically questioning why mankind is drifting away from the God that he is working for as a member of the Church of England. So if we look back again, why do men, so again that is the subject, now not reck his rod? By reck, that is short for reckon. Why do men not reckon? In this case, doesn't say, it's not like, well, are you happy? Well, I reckon. It's not that kind of reckon. And it's not the kind of reckoning that you're seeing in TV shows like Game of Thrones, anything like that. In this case, reck means to recognize. It's short for recognize. And then rod in this case is like the scepter of a king. So if you've ever seen pictures of Queen Elizabeth II or any ruler in British history, I think Game of Thrones may have some of this, where there's actually a scepter that the king holds on to make sure that people realize, hey, I'm the king. He's calling that a rod in this poem. So he messes with the syntax, but the question that he's really asking is underneath that. And sometimes we have to work really hard at that in poetry. The good news for you is I did not choose any poets in this particular semester that change word order around too much. Yoda does in Star Wars, but that's something totally different. All right, going to the next thing, denotation versus connotation. This is extremely important to know. Denotation is literally the dictionary definition. And what I'd like for you to do, if you've got time, is go ahead and hit the pause button and write down all the definitions of the word house that you can think of. And leave out the part about the medical doctor that used to be on Fox television. That had the bad bedside manner, but he was a brilliant diagnosis person, whatever you want to call it. So hit the pause button, write down as many definitions of house as you can think of, and then hit the play button when you're done. All right, so how many definitions did you come up with? Well, let's see. One is a dwelling where families live. That's the easiest definition. But did you think about these definitions? A legislative body in government. We have something called a House of Representatives, and technically our Senate is called the House of Senate. So when you hear the words, the House passed a bill today, that is the House of Representatives that passed a bill. House can be a royal family. So the current royal family is the House of Windsor in England. But there are many houses, like the Lancasters and the Yorks and the Plantagenets and so on and so forth, that actually were in power at some time. Have you ever been to a casino? You ever heard the term, the house always wins? House in this case means the casino's bank. That is what always wins. House can be a verb, to store something. You may have heard about a museum housing a collection of Gauguin or something like that. It is storing that. House could also mean to protect, to take into a home and protect. So that's another verb. So, and I'm sure that I'm forgetting at least 2 or 3 definitions here. I don't have my dictionary in front of me, but the fact is, there are all these literal definitions of the word house. That is denotation. Now, on the flip side, let's look at connotation. This is a word's emotional, psychological, social, and historical overtones. And I'm reading that straight off the slide, I know. But let me give you an example of connotation. If I said I am going to the house for Thanksgiving, people are like, oh, that's nice. But if I say I'm going home for Thanksgiving, look at the difference there. House is more like a building. Home gives you that warm, fuzzy feeling. It's where your family lives. It's where people are going to love you no matter what. It's a safe haven for you. There's some warmth there. There's probably some good food there. It gives you all these warm, happy feelings inside. That is connotation as opposed to denotation, which is just a literal definition. So know the difference between denotation and connotation as you go through these poems. And notice the word choice. In all of these, I think you're going to see quite a bit of connotation in addition to the denotation. All right, next is the imagery. These are sensuous words. Notice that they're the 5 senses. And then, of course, there's the kinetic and kinesthetic imagery, which has to do with motion or energy. So, visual, that's the eyes, what people see. Auditory, that's what people hear. Olfactory, in case you don't know, that is the nose, smells. Gustatory, that is the taste, that has to do with the taste buds. Tactile images, that has to do with feel, the feeling of touch. Notice how often our authors, especially the visual imagery. Remember, we just looked at William Carlos Williams's poem about the red wheelbarrow and the white chickens. So he created, by using nothing more than words, he uses words as a paintbrush to create this vivid image in your mind. That's what a lot of visual imagery, you're going to see it a lot in, I think, every poem. Robert Frost's The Road Not Taken especially. Okay. And then symbolism. We talked about this already when we talked about fiction. So symbolism is the use of symbols. It's the object that has meaning in and of itself, yet also represents something larger. And I put down nation's flag in the parentheses. Right now in the news, there is a lot of talk about people walking on the American flag. Now some people will fight those that are walking on the flag, because to them, that flag represents the soldiers that died for our country. It represents great American values. It represents everything that makes America what it is. And those that are walking on it say, well, this is our free speech, and we're saying that there's something wrong with America, so we're walking on the flag. So whichever side of that debate you're on, there's no doubt that even though the flag is nothing more than a piece of red, white, and blue cloth, it symbolizes something much larger. Therefore, that piece of cloth needs to be treated with great respect. Then there's the cultural universal symbols known around the world. And of course, we've talked about the cross. The cross that Jesus hung on is a symbol among Christianity for the sacrifice that Jesus made. And then, of course, there's some symbolism that goes on inside the work itself. It only means something inside the work. I think Daddy is going to have quite a bit of that. There are also symbolic words, the symbolic words in Christianity. If you've ever been to some kind of a ceremony with the Catholic Church, a lot of their ceremonies are done in Latin, but the words have great meaning. Symbolic actions, and I've put a man plowing his field in here. That is hard work. That is working the earth and trying to make one's own meals out of it in order to, plant the seeds that will grow and then be reaped. Symbolic settings such as church services and historic sites. Here near Albany, we've got the Andersonville historic site up there close to Americus. And not far from Americus also is Plains, Georgia, where Jimmy Carter essentially launched his campaign to become president. These historic sites all have great significance to us, especially the Andersonville one, because it is a site that is left over from a very, very violent and very emotional time in American history. And sometimes we need to visit these historic battlefields to remind ourselves that we've got it pretty good now, and that the sacrifices that the Union soldiers made, and even the Confederate soldiers to a certain extent made, eventually caused our country to reunite again and has made our country stronger for it. And then, of course, symbolic situations such as war battles and ceremonies. And finally, the last thing I want to talk to here, I don't remember if I talked about this in the prose slideshow or not, but I think it's important to note in our poetry, and that is allusion. And this is a reference to something that the poet expects the reader to already have prior knowledge about. They can be brief quotations, they can be a reference to historical events, they can be a reference to another art form, such as another poem or a song or a painting or something like that. When William Shakespeare wrote Sonnet 130, he was poking fun at an Italian poet named Petrarch. He never mentions Petrarch in this entire poem. Yet people in his time would have instinctively known, oh yeah, he's poking fun at Petrarch. William Shakespeare is not making fun of a lady in that poem, and we'll talk about that when we get to that slideshow. But it is important to know that William Shakespeare's readers would have known that at the time. Just like today, if I make any kind of a reference to, say, American Idol, everybody in the United States and probably the world knows about American Idol. That it is a talent show of vocal performers. I don't have to say what American Idol is if I allude to it in the 21st century, because just about everybody in this year knows what American Idol is. But let's say 100 years from now, there is no more American Idol, and somebody reads a poem about American Idol, they may need to be told what American Idol is, because the illusion is no longer fresh like it is for today's readers. T.S. Eliot, who we're not reading this semester, was very notorious for a lot of allusions to things in the 1920s, And when one reads The Wasteland, it is an extremely difficult read because nobody in the 21st century knows what the heck he's talking about, whereas those people that were in the 1920s would have gotten it right away. So not many people even teach The Wasteland anymore for that very reason. So an allusion is a reference to something that the writer expects the audience to know. So that's poetry, at least that's an introduction to poetry. We'll talk about a lot of this stuff again as we talk about each individual author and each individual poem. And I hope that you have found this presentation useful to you. Refer back to it if you need to. Refer back to the slideshow if you need to. Maybe Google some of these terms if I didn't explain them well enough. But make sure that you understand them as you read these poems and start to write your papers on them. Because some understanding of poetry and how poetry works will be crucial to writing good papers. All right, so that's it. And from this point forward, I hope that you enjoy your poetry and happy reading.